It's great to meet you in person, and I am very happy that you're part of this Blueprints for Success and share your story. I know that you're a professor, that you have a business, and you've been part of architecture. So I'd like to welcome you to our series that we running. And yeah, looking forward to hearing more about you, what you can offer now, in the past and in the future.
Thank you very much for the invite. I'm flattered, actually. I'm really flattered. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about you. What makes you tick? What are your hobbies? What are your interests? Before we get into the nitty-gritty.
Okay, so if we go for hobbies, I would say there are three main hobbies. First, traveling.
Mm-hmm.
I love to travel. I
You
love
and
to
I
mix.
are very much aligned in that part.
Yeah, and I like to mix business and pleasure. So
Mm-hmm.
very often I try to develop relationships with people or university where I go back and forth so I can bring the family. So I would say that number one. Number two would be definitely reading. I read a lot, and I always think I don't read enough. And as we'll
What is a
discuss,
lot?
I read a lot. If I don't read 1 or 2 hours a day, I'm not happy. I
Mm-hmm.
was actually talking about it. We went to take a walk in the woods before, and I was saying I do not look for the position or the I don't want to say celebrity, but the fame or the big position. I want to learn something every day.
Mm-hmm.
And when I don't, that's not good because I get grouchy. So, and the third I would say is movies. Everything
Mm.
about movies. I've been watching movies for the last, like, I see movies in French, Spanish, any language that has subtitles. I'm a big movie buff also. I would say these three are my big, with the family, I would say that takes 90% of my time.
Okay. And so, what would you say is your favorite movie or your favorite series?
Okay, my favorite movie, and I like this question. These are not easy. I really like The Shawshank Redemption.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very good movie. I love The Schindler's List,
Mm-hmm.
which I really liked. Series, what's it called? 6 Feet Under. Have you ever seen it?
Yes. Yes.
I love that series. And the it's on Netflix. The Gambit.
Oh, yes. That was really good.
I
Really,
really
really
like that
good.
one. But
Yeah.
there are so many. But I would
I know.
say like The Shawshank and The Usual Suspect, which probably you've
Mhm.
seen also with
Yes.
Kevin
Yes.
Spacey, and I like these types of movies.
I like movies where you can think. I must be honest, I'm a bit of a sci-fi fan,
Okay.
and I like spy movies. So I like good plots, and I'm not talking bad. Obvious where you can figure out the answer. I like a little bit of complexity. And I must say the series that has been probably my favorite, and again, I watch a lot. It's difficult to tell, but usually if I watch it more than once, that's a sign that I like
Mm-hmm.
it, is The Americans. I really, really liked that series because I felt that it was just every single one was tense, and it really just did help you understand the nature of relationships, commitment, all of that. So yeah, that was definitely my favorite series. But I can't say that I necessarily have a favorite movie. I think it has evolved as I've evolved.
Oh yeah, of course,
So yeah,
of course.
but
But
I
you,
can't say I have a favorite.
but
But I do like the Jason Bournes and those type of things, which I just like them. I can't say that they're deep or
no,
reveal
no, no, it's
anything.
fine.
But yeah.
As I mentioned, I love a lot of type of. I love Shawshank for the whole story. Like he gets to prison, he didn't do anything. And at the end, when he says, "I had to go to prison to become a criminal,"
Mm-hmm.
and the friendships he develops. Like I love that movie. I think there's a lot of deep under thinking, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
spiritually and mentally. But there's so many movies. Like with my kids, I always watch funny movies. That's all he wants to watch, right? I used to watch a lot of Bruce Lee because I did a lot of martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
So my wife loves theater, so I've started to do that also. So I love to explore, and as you'll see, even in my work, doing twice the same thing is tough for me. I would
Mm-hmm.
be way wealthier, not wealthier. I would be richer, money wise, if I wouldn't be the way I am now.
If you focus on one
Yeah,
thing only, yeah.
but I consider that I'm wealthier because I actually do a lot of stuff at the, I would say, the intersection of different fields, domains, and subjects.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit around your professional background. So tell me a little bit about that. Where did you start and where are you today?
Okay, so that's it. Actually, is an interesting story because I've always wanted to do business. I used to play football or soccer, we call it here. And me and my friends will always say, "So, what are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to have a business. I'm going to have a business. I'm going to have a business." But with my background, family background, you had to be a lawyer, an engineer, or I would say a doctor. These
Mm-hmm.
would be probably the top three options, right? So I ended up going in engineering. So I
Mm-hmm.
studied electrical engineering at Polytechnique in Montreal, and I actually did not like it much for many reasons. One of which was it was very abstract, and I was more of a hands-on person back then. But I was fortunate because the last year, I think it was 1994, the last year was the first year that they created a new concentration that's called technology management. So it was
Mm-hmm.
one of the very few programs, I think, in all North America that allowed you, even though you were in a scientific field, to start to do management. Prior, then instead of doing an MBA or certificate, it was
Yeah.
in the program. So I jumped on that and I did very well. So I really loved it because that was like, and as you'll see, I love to be at the frontiers of many things.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, they asked me, they said, Pierre, maybe you should think of doing a master's, right? And I said, nah, I want to go work. So when I finished my bachelor, I went into the IT industry,
Mm-hmm.
and I worked for Microsoft. Then I worked for a few implementation companies, and I did implementation, I did training, pre-sales, and in parallel, I started my master's, right? Because technology management was something that interested me. And as we moved along, right? So that was about 98. I finished my program and I said, okay, so now what's next, right? And then I was going to go to the States just before the crash. So I was offered a very good job in California, the dream for the kid like me who wanted to leave and so forth. But one of my professors, another one, not the same one, he said, Pierre, you should think of doing a PhD. And I said, why would I do a PhD? Like, I want to do business. He goes, Pierre, think of the liberty, think of all the advantages. Don't look at it too much in the short term. Look at it as in 20, 30 years. So I remember I went with my best friend. We went on vacation and I was on the beach and I did the pros and cons in the sand. And I said, the only reason I wouldn't do it would be money because I had no spouse. I didn't even have a girlfriend. I lived with my parents. I was very career focused. So I said, you know what? If I don't do it now, I'll never do it. But even when I did that, the plan was for me to go for McKinsey, SAP, BCG. That was the plan. I never had the plan to become a prof. So I did my PhD. I did my PhD in e-commerce when it started, when Amazon was
Yeah.
starting and so forth. I worked on marketplaces even before anybody was speaking about that. And then once I finished, again, I had another talk with my prof again, and he goes, Pierre, think about it. Don't look at the short term, look at the long term. Long story short, I said, you know what? Let's try to be a prof. So I became a prof at a university called Université de Sherbrooke, which is about in eastern townships of Montreal. It's about an hour and a half from here. And I really became a prof. Like I did my course load. I did my research, statistics. I love statistics, and I did that. And I became full professor very fast. Like I think I was full in 5 years, but I wasn't happy because I had a lot of questions. Number one was like what's happening outside the doors of the university because I was really involved in business before. And second, a lot of people were talking to me about strategy. They're saying,
Mm-hmm.
Pierre, you have the profile of a strategist. Have you thought about teaching IT strategy? But I didn't know what IT strategy was. And I still actually don't know what it is today, but we'll talk about that later.
Mm-hmm.
And long story short, in the midst of all that, so I became full. I really was not happy. I was happy in my personal life, but at work, something was missing. One of my friends, whose name is Eli Elia, a good friend of mine, he gave me a book. He goes, Pierre, you have to read this book. It's called Enterprise Architecture as Strategy from Gene Ross and the MIT team. So I remember I read that like in 3 days, and I said, this is what I want to do. It was automatic. I said, that's what I want to do. So that was about 2010. So I stopped everything. I kept one student. I stopped all of my activities, and I said, this is where I'm going. And I'm stubborn. And when I decide to master something or at least be proficient in something, I will do everything I need to be proficient. Long story short, I take this route. And one of my students in an MBA class, how can I explain that? I love people. And as
Mm-hmm.
you'll see, everything I do in life, I choose based on the people. So if I
Mm-hmm.
like somebody and have a good feeling, I always try to connect and get something out of them, of course, and I give them and we evolve together. So I had a student who I did not know was not the head, but one of the heads of a huge company, if not the biggest in Montreal. And I went to see him and I said, you know what? I'd like to work with you. Long story short, I end up having my first EA project because of
Mm-hmm.
him, which was completely like out of the blue. And then don't forget, I get into the industry. I've never done an EA project, never. I've read quite a few stuff on that, but I'm still like, I would say new. I meet people who have been doing this for like supposedly 20 years. They're expert. Everybody's an expert today. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, I start working with them. It's interesting and so forth. And very fast, I would say in a few months, I said, okay, now this is good. Now this is very bad. Okay. So very rapidly, I saw what was working and what was not working. And actually, I think a lot of things are not working. And it's not a criticism, it's just part of enterprise being social systems, right? A lot of people, a big bank, it was a bank. So I said, okay, what do we do now? And in parallel, I met my friend who became my partner and my co-author, Bernard Gagnon, and
Mm-hmm.
we just fused, right? And we said, okay, so what do we do? And in 2012, was it 2012? 2011, 2012, nobody was talking about business architecture. Nobody. And we said, this is what we're going to do because most of the problems were not technical. Most of the problem was everything that's around the technology.
Yes.
Long story short, when this happened, we clicked and we said, you know what? Because I've always wanted to write a book because I've published a lot of articles and so forth, but I never went mainstream, as you could say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I said, let's do that. And Bernard had the same ambition, right? So we started to write the book. And the book, if you want, we'll discuss about the book. The book was a huge journey because what an architect should be is not what an architect is in most organizations today.
True.
So the breadth of what we wanted to do, which is basically tie all the activities together, right? Because that's the objective of an architect. An architect that builds a house is responsible not only of the plan of the house, is responsible of the schedule, and is responsible for the alignment. Is not only responsible for one plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, this is not the way companies work, right? So long story short, we started to do that. And we started to write a book, which was supposed to be a 2-year project and ended up being, I think, 4, 5 almost. But we can go into the details of why, right? By the way, I'm very happy I did that, because I don't think I could be doing what I'm doing today if I did not take the long route. So long story short, while we're writing the book, like I started to talk about the book in my class and so forth, and a lot of people started to approach us. So we had project even before we finished the book, right? So anyway, basically once things settled down in terms of writing and research, we said, let's start a company to teach and to coach. Okay. And I always prefer the word coach than consulting, because one of the criteria for me for architecture to work is I cannot do it for you. Because if I do it for you, the second I leave, it's not going to work.
Yeah, there's nothing left for you. Yeah.
Voila. Because you have to do it your way. You have to embed it your way. You have to find the place on which you're going to stand, which are not the same in every company. So long story short, we started to do that. And basically I had a practice since then in parallel to my teaching. But the most important thing is not that, is that by understanding that architecture can tie things together, I said, let's go one level higher, which is strategy. Because one of the reason our book took so long is we embedded architecture in the strategy literature. And then I said, you know what? I have to go one level higher. So I started to read what we had started before, but like I was much more involved in reading about strategy, all the authors and so forth. And I got involved with what's called ASP, which is the Association of Strategic Planning, which is now the International Association of Strategy Professional. So I joined the board for one reason, to integrate the whole strategy management system, if you want to call it. And for me, what is the core? It's the architecture, right?
Yeah.
So I took the idea of architecture, I would say at a one level of abstraction higher,
Yes.
to the level of strategy. And that's what I love to do most now today. So that's the whole story. And in parallel, another thing I did is that I did a university certificate in corporate governance. And so I took the class, I took the exam and so forth. And now I'm actually working with the group. They're called Le Collège des Administrateurs de Société. They're very big in the province of Quebec. And I'm working with them to integrate strategy and architecture concepts in the corporate literature. Because for me, the anchor of every company is business architecture.
Yeah.
But
that is where you and I agree very much.
But it's tough, right? It's very tough to do that because architecture has to integrate. Architecture is not only about doing a plan. And based on my understanding and my experience, the tough part is integrating. So do people do the tough part? They don't do the tough part. They go to the easy part, which is let's do a plan. Let's do the plan of the house. Yeah, but how are you going to integrate it? How are you going to schedule the project? And then comes the problems, because who's going to do that? The architect or the portfolio manager?
Yeah.
How are you going to work with the strategist? And when people ask me today, Pierre, what's your profession? I always say a strategist. I never say a business architect. Never. Because I think, in my opinion, and again, that's my personal, I would say, way of seeing it, a business architecture is a strategist. It's just that it's probably at a level of abstraction lower, more technical, more detail. But I still think the purview of envisioning the future and implementing it is the role of the business architecture. So by ricochet, I consider myself a strategist, which I never would have done even 5 years ago. I never would have dared to do that. But now we know more than strategists. And you know why we know more? Because we not only know how to do a FFOM, SWOT, but we actually know how to implement after.
Yeah.
So bridging the gap, I think, comes to people with our background, which are at the intersection of many fields.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's my story.
I also like to think of architecture at the macro level. I feel like strategy is almost a means to an end in some instances. So at a macro level with architecture, I want to understand the environment, the ecosystem. So we talk about businesses, but there's also things happening. Are there financial crises? Are there, we've been through enough the last 3 years to say that we talk about adaptability and being agile and those type of things, but it's not just that. It's at a macro level. An architect, when they build a house, understands the ground, understands where the water comes from, understands the land. And I always say that from an architectural point of view, you've got to be able to go from bird's eye view of the ecosystem right down to boots on the ground. And it's a very unusual role. A lot of people don't really understand this because many years ago, when I tried to help people do their personal vision down to their daily goals, I had a very separate group. One could come up with ideas of what they want in the next 20 years and had a vision for where they're going to go, but they couldn't tell me what they would do tomorrow. And the other group, they would say, oh no, I'm just going to do this, I'm just going to do this, and give me a couple of days ahead. It was so shocking to me because I thought, how do you not piece what the 20-year goal is with and maybe your professor was really good in this sense by saying, look beyond and do it today. And for me, that was an architectural concept. That was something that is, because I often say to people, architecture is about design. And design is complex. And the simpler you can make the design, the better you are at it, being a designer. So you have to consider multiple things. Yeah, I would say even before strategy at a higher level, there's the macro environment. And we need to understand that because to lead the strategy, we have to understand the ecosystem that surrounds us. So yeah, it's quite a big job. We discussed some of your key turning points in your career. And if you were to advise somebody else, let's say somebody who's interested in being a business architect, what would you say to them today, knowing all your history and your background and where you are at? How would you help somebody who's an architect
Okay.
or wants to be an architect? Yeah.
Okay. What I think the first thing we need to do is to define what is business architecture.
Yeah.
Okay. And so there's a myriad of definitions, right? And if there's one thing I've realized these last few years is arguing or emphasizing of the definition is not going to fix any problem. Nonetheless, and there's a big nonetheless. Okay. For me, the breadth of the work of an architect, of a business architect, has at the minimum 3 facets. Minimum. Okay. And when I explain it, I always I do the metaphor of the bridge, right? So let's say you wanted to build a bridge, right? So here you just came to Montreal, right? I think recently I don't know if you went through our new bridge, Champlain Bridge, right?
I did, yes.
Yeah. So it took years and years before they decided to do a project. But let's say we would sum up in a few minutes. So number one, the city of Montreal says we want to devise a bridge. Okay. So they got to decide more or less what they want, right? Number one, is it going to be modern, more architecture based, one arc, two arcs? Is it one bridge or two bridge? Because in many cities now they have two bridges, one going in, one going out.
Yeah.
Long story short, they have to decide what they want. Okay. And I call that in French les requis, the requisites that you want, right?
Yeah.
Once they have these, they go and they find an architect. And that's the magic word. They find an architect. It's not, they don't find an entrepreneur, or they find an architect. Yes, I am sure you and I agree on that, right?
Yes.
So when the architect, when he starts working, he works with the city. He doesn't work on his own. He works with the city. When I mean him, team, right?
Yeah.
And the first thing he does, what I call an overall plan. Okay. So the overall plan is a big drawing, right, of the complete bridge. Not just the foundations or part or the details, but the whole picture with some key characteristics of the materials and how it's going to be solid enough, right, to be able for I don't know how many million cars to pass for the next 50 years. So I call this the overall plan, right? Once they do that, either after or in parallel, because sometimes they start in parallel, they do what's called a master schedule. They say, okay, now we want to build the whole bridge, which is a huge chunk, right? So how are we going to tackle it? Number one, of course, we're going to do foundations, right? We're not going to try to do the arch before doing the foundations.
Yeah.
So then they plan and they say, okay, now this is going to take 5 years, X part, Y part, and so forth. So they devise the whole project into projects, into sub projects, I should say. So that's what I call the master schedule. And then, very importantly, they have to guide each of the sub projects. So even though they're going to hire a lot of people to do the sub projects, they have to be there to be sure that everything is aligned to the master schedule and the overall plan. There's no other way around it. If not, who would go on the bridge, right? Who would go on the bridge? Okay. And you know what's fascinating is you cannot do anything on the site if there's not an engineer. Because I call them engineer, but like for me, engineer and architect is very similar, right? Because for bridge, very often they're gonna be called civil engineers, right? But for me, it's the principle of architecting. Architecting is for me, you devise the whole plan, you devise the master schedule, and you align people. You cannot do one of the three, okay? One of the three is not enough. Because actually, what makes the plan viable is the practice at the end that ensures that everybody's aligned.
Yeah.
Okay. I love this question because when you talk about that, people never figure something so simple. So why would in a company would you do huge projects and not have an architect from the beginning till the end? But anyway, I can go into the details because I'm PMP certified. Like I got many certification. I did many projects. So I think there's a lot of politics and the power of projects into company, which I don't disagree of. But nonetheless, an architect should devise the overall plan, which I call the target enterprise or target business architecture. So that's the first component. The master schedule, I call the transformation plan. Okay. And basically, a transformation plan is a portfolio of projects, but based on architecture. That's the big difference. Because instead of being devised based on the strategy requisite, they're based on the overall plan, which make them much, much more sounder than just high level requisites that you do in strategy.
Yeah.
And the third is the alignment. So what does alignment mean? Alignment means we need to work with the strategist to help do the feasibility analysis. We need to work with the portfolio managers to be sure that we're doing things in the right order. We need to work with the risk people to be sure that risks are mitigated. We need to work with project managers or solution architects to be sure that they respect the guidelines, right?
Yeah.
For me, that is architecture. So for me, the piece of art is the three components. And everybody asks me, yeah, Pierre, I understand, but which is the most important? Because it always gets to that, right?
Yeah.
So if I had to say one, and I'm always hesitating, one thing I can tell you, it's not the overall plan. Because if you look at a good transformation plan, which is the master schedule, you actually know the overall plan because it's embedded in it. So it's not the overall plan. But what do companies do? They spend 80% of their energy doing the overall plan. And they don't think about how they're going to schedule the whole transformation, and they don't know how to align people. But don't get me wrong, very often it's because of past histories. And I always call that inertia. There's a lot of inertia in companies, right?
Yeah.
Okay, who does the project, right? It's the project portfolio, right? Of course. Who does the strategy? It's the strategist. Who does the project? Is the project. That's fine. But what's the glue that ties everything together? In my vocabulary, in my way of scheming a transformation, is the business architecture.
Yeah.
So based on that, I'm sorry I had to take a bit of a route, but for me, that's very important. Okay. So you know what you want. Yeah, there's three things, right? But these are big things. So number one, what would I say? Okay. The first thing is knowing these three components, you have to get involved into projects doing many functions, and we're
Yeah.
working with many teams. Because as we mentioned, as you and I mentioned before, it's never the same thing. In one
Yeah.
company, you're going to get in via strategy. In another company, you're going to get in via portfolio management. In another company, you're going to get it in via engagement. So it's never the same. So the
That's really good suggestion.
and in theoretical language, we call this equifinality, which I
Hmm.
didn't know before. Equifinality, you can start by many things, but you got to end. It leads you to something, but it doesn't mean that you start always from the same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
And that took me a lot of time to learn. Okay. But whenever there's an opportunity, you got to take it because
Yeah.
architecture is so big, it's so tough. You got to get in any way you can.
Mm.
But you need a lot of diverse background, right? So I would work like I did some projects, I did some technical, I did some strategy, I did some portfolio, I did a little of all these things, right? Which allows me to put myself looking at a problem from different perspectives, right? So
Yeah.
my big criteria would be that. Because
Mm.
you know a lot of people are going to tell you, oh, you should do engineering, you should do X, you should do Y. I don't agree with that. And by the way, if you look at the interviews like of people I really admire, do you know how they evaluate? I'll tell you how they evaluate an architect. So let's say you would interview me and you would say, Pierre, so I'm working with bank XY in New Zealand. We're having this issue. What would you do? If the person gets up, takes a pen, does a drawing, and explains to you components, that's an architect. So for me, that's more important that where did you start? Did you start as a business analyst? For me, it's as long as you do many of these and your
Mm.
focus is to understand the three components, you'll get there.
Mm.
I think that's very important. The other thing I can say is there's always, like, I'm a big fan of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. I'm a huge fan. Okay. I'm a huge fan. I've read everything they've written. I went to the assembly this year. So I'm a big fan. And they always talk about hard versus soft sciences, right?
Yeah.
So I think you need an equilibrium between the two. And that's tough to do because I may be more inclined to do hard. You may be more inclined to do soft. And hard and soft, it's not positive or negative. It's just we need all
Different.
of them.
Just different. Yeah.
No, but we need all of them because
Yeah.
I've met a lot of great architects that do amazing plans, but they cannot do a talk an hour with you to exchange and find a solution to a problem because
Mm.
there's too much in their head. I've met other people who are great talkers, right? But ask them to devise something complex and they can't, right? So
Hmm.
the difficulty is we have to do both.
Yes.
Many backgrounds, certifications, and so forth are an asset. The other thing that I would do for me is very important. Choose your boss.
Mm.
Okay. So if there's one thing I did well, I've always chosen my bosses. Always. If you don't admire him, if problems happen and he's not going to back you up, I'm out.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you got to choose your boss.
That's a good suggestion, to be honest. I think certainly when I was younger, I always focused on what I need to give to the business. And I've had some really good bosses and I've had some really horrible ones. And so I suppose that interviewing your boss is also an important part of knowing who you're working with and if they like where you're going or what you want to do or your personal goals. Those things all matter
Be-
in
Because
interviews.
if you do a real EA project or BA
Mm.
project, I can guarantee you there's going to be a problem. And I can guarantee you the problem is going to be within a month before you start. Okay. I could bet, I don't want to bet my house, but you understand my point. So what
Yeah.
happens? Let's say you're my boss, right? And I have to go and talk to the portfolio people and tell them, hey guys, you cannot do your portfolio without us. And what is he going to do? He's going to go see his boss. He's going to go, what? What is the business architecture doing portfolio? He's supposed to do the overall plan. He's not supposed
Mm.
to do the master schedule. But if I don't help in the master schedule is never going to work because it's going to keep doing rework and it's going to cost 5 times what it was supposed to cost. So in less than a week, you are going to get a call because I was too aggressive or I said X or I said Y, right? So if the person does not understand that,
Mm.
I would never take the job. And the last thing, believe it or not, I would go where the money is and where the problems are. Because if there's no money, I did a lot of projects. They start and we don't have the budget.
Finish.
Yeah, I'm sure you went through that, right?
Mm.
And you got to go to a place where there's complexity.
Yeah.
Because if you want to sell the argument that you should work with the portfolio managers and you should work with the strategists, you're not going to do that in a small, medium company, right? They're going to say, Pierre, what are you doing? We already have scarce resources. So and the reason I'm telling you that is because I started with Microsoft, right? My first job was with
Mm.
Microsoft. So I go in, Windows 95. I don't know if you remember because like I'm pretty
Yeah.
old, right? So I started working on August 24th, 1995. So the day
Mm.
Windows 95 came out. I had never worked before except for like jobs to pay my schooling. And I had never worked on Windows, right? I was a newbie. But I went into Microsoft and I saw my boss, which was Pierre Boutillette. I'll never forget his name. And he goes, I go, Pierre, what do I have to do? He goes, do your job. I go, what does that mean? What's my schedule? He goes, do your job. That's what you got to do. And whenever you need me, give me a call. And I did need him. And right away, I had the resource, the support, and many things happened within the year that and then I went to work for small, medium companies where it's very more difficult to do that. There's a lot of advantages to work for a small company. There's a lot of them. But in terms of architecture, complex problems, I don't think that would be my
Mm.
first choice.
Mm.
I don't think so because the budgets are so difficult to have, right? And I've never did an EA project in which you really see results before 6 months, a year, 18 months.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have, but like I have not. And
No,
so
I think there are a lot of people who want their projects to be finished in that time, but no, generally there's a huge scope creep and a delay. Mm.
because you see, when you say that, I love when you're saying that because when you say we're in the project,
Mm.
but we're not at the project level.
Mm.
I don't work in projects. I will
Mm.
advise projects, but I don't work in projects.
Yeah,
I'm
agree.
at a higher level because my job is to tie the projects with an S together. And
Mm.
that's what people don't understand. A lot of people come to me, they go, Pierre, we have a project. We want you to get in and do architecture. What's my question? I tell them, so what's the difference between a business architect and a business analyst? And then, well, no, I'm not at the same level. Not only do I take the requisites, I give the requisites. Okay, it's
Mm.
completely different, right?
Mm.
So it's not
Mm.
somebody because he clicks X, Y, and Z that's going to tell me, Pierre, I want it that way. Man, no. I'm going to decide with you because you and me have the holistic picture of the company. That's number one.
Mhm.
And number two, our job is for all the projects to form a coherent whole, right?
Mm.
Because I'll give
Yes.
you an example. We did a talk once, and I don't know if it's 2018, 2020, it was like 200 people. So anyway, so we're doing the presentation, and I think I asked the question. I said, okay, guys, you guys all did projects. Please tell me once, has it ever happened that you did a project that something must have been done before and was not? So somebody said, I've never done a project in which there wasn't something that should have been done before. Never.
Wow.
So no, but think about it. Just
Mm.
this demonstrates, just only this demonstrates that you need a holistic view and you need for the architects to work with the portfolio people.
Yep.
So anyway, so I would say, I hope I answered your question, but I think it's a complex question to answer.
It
But the
is.
last word would be in Buffett language would be extend your circle of competence. Okay.
Mm.
He always says that. Okay. Number one, you got to know what it is. So don't
Mm.
aim for a big circle. Doesn't mean that it's big that you're good. Start with a small one. but don't accept it for it to be small forever. Increase it a bit,
Yeah.
of course. Like, if not, life is going to be boring. So let's say
Yes.
you would start from project manager. Okay, you would start from project manager, then you would add some leadership competencies, then some design competence, so forth, and then you would end up with a broad set of competencies that allows you to be an architect. I came from a
Yeah.
different background, right? I came from the IT, so my core is not going to be like you. It's going to be something else. But overall, I will have an ensemble of competences that allows me to address complex problems. So
Yes.
that would be my guidance if I had to give any.
That's really good advice. And I do like the idea of, you mentioned earlier the soft skills versus the technical skills. Where would you place yourself? Would you say you're more technical or more soft skills? And what comes more naturally? Like if you didn't have to do one, which one would you give up?
Oh, I wouldn't give up any of the two. Okay,
Okay.
but I love this question because your question actually made me think for the last week. And number one, okay, and again, based on Charlie Munger, I'm sure you know who Charlie Munger is. So he's the Berkshire vice chairman. And the reason I love him, or I love the way he thinks, he always talk about the lattice work of mental models, which
Hmm.
is the idea that you combine different perspectives to analyze a problem so that you can solve it, right? Because he always says no problem is unidimensional. It's always
Yeah.
pluridiscipline, always pluridimensional, right?
Mm.
So you need a lattice work. So lattice work means several models, strategy, finance, so forth. And then he always goes to say after, he always says that if I had to decide, I would start with the heart. And you know
Okay.
what? Yes. And I say the same thing to my children. I always say the same thing. I said, you know what you do when you're 30, for me, it's your purview. But if you have a background where it's in French on dit sciences pure, in pure science or medical science,
Yeah.
you have that's forever, right?
Yeah.
And not only will you be able to do an MBA after without doing prerequisites that you do not have, but number
Mm-hmm.
two, it's more difficult. So my answer is I would start with technical things. Everything
Mm-hmm.
that's technical, background, analysis, just to get the mining to making good decision and so forth. But very rapidly you get to the human, right? If you get to the
Which
human,
is harder.
which is it's actually harder.
It's
But
harder, yes.
it is harder, but think about it. You're tackling a hard problem, and then if you get to the core of the issue, which is hard, if you don't have the heart even, you're even more of a trouble, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But don't forget, I was a business by nature when I was a kid,
Mm.
and I was forced. I don't want to say forced, but I was like pretty much enticed to do an engineering background. And today when I tell my children, I always tell them my worst schooling experience was Polytechnique because I didn't fit. But
Mm.
my best learning experience was Polytechnique
Yeah.
because I didn't tell you about my finance background, but now I'm taking a course with
Mm-hmm.
Damodaran, like it's a committee, right? Because I want to be very good in valuation because as we have to value things when we do project and nobody does it well. So I want to learn how to do that, right? So I love doing that. But nonetheless, I need a theoretical background and I need a solid background at the beginning.
Yeah.
But if I can criticize myself, because I love to criticize myself, I started with the hard. I went a lot more into the soft leadership, governance, and by the way, soft is in no way because a lot of people say, "What do you mean by soft?" It's not, I don't know, degrading. It's not that. It's just a question that
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
Charlie always says it can be summarized in a few variables that are simplistic and nice to see, right?
Mm.
That's the magic. If you do thermodynamics, physics, there's a few equations and they solve not 100% of the problem, but 80% of the problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's have this as a background. But to get back to my criticism is I stopped focusing on the hard for a while
Mm.
and I noticed it after.
Mm.
I noticed it after. And that's what then I started to study the lean and the Toyota approach and so forth to get back into the hard. So keeping this equilibrium, I would say, move in tandem, right?
Yeah.
If you come from a softer background, which is not negative, just try to do some hard, right? But if I have a choice, and that's exactly what I tell my children, do the hard before you have kids, because I'll give you an example. My wife, she would love to do some architecture, right? And so she's at a phase when she decided, Pierre, maybe it could be. I said, oh, that would be great. You could design our house. And what happened? She did one phone call to the university. You have to be full time. It has to take 5 years. Clack, 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 clack. Oh, it's never going to happen. So you see? So when you get into big things, physics, math, of course you can learn forever. And I encourage you to learn forever. But if I had to develop the sponge, which is the brain, I would go for the hard when I'm younger. Because I think the rest, there's a lot of intuition also that can help you. But intuition is going to help you less when you do des équations Fourier and big complex stuff. Then they're going to help you when you do psychology. And because I'll give you an example. I'm reading a psychology book now. I love this book. I'll send you I love this book because, and you know what? They talk about statistics. They talk about biases. They talk about Kahneman. They talk about all these things which you and me go through when we have projects. So I love doing that. But when you want to implement an IT system, you got to implement the IT system which has some core mathematics or science purview that you have to follow. So I would say, but I would never leave one behind. And I would go even further. I refused a lot of stuff because of that. And one of the reasons I'm who I am today is because they wanted me to do that. And I said no. So one of my first jobs, what led me to go back to school was I was very good at doing pre-sales. Very good. Because I knew how to talk. I had an engineering background. So they wanted me to be a rep, right? They said, Pierre, you're going to make a lot more money. Think about that. Think about buying a yacht and so forth. But I said, that's not what I want to do. I want to do the lattice work. But I didn't know how to frame it. But that's what I meant. And I was heartbroken because I couldn't do both. And for a while I said, am I wrong or am I right? But if you look at today, all the people I admire, and there's a lot of people you can admire, but the people I admire, Buffett, Jobs, they're all multifaceted. They're all. Of course, they have one in which they dominate, right? But I'll give you an example. Like I just read Tim Cook's biography, right? Everybody's thinking, oh, Steve Jobs was this creative genius. Yes, he was. But what brought Apple to where it is, it's not that. It's engineering. It's production. He was a big fan of Toyota. That's how we met Tim Cook. And without Tim Cook and embedding hardware and software in Asia, Apple would not be where it was today. So anyway, so it's tough. I always tell that to my student. Being an architect is tougher than other disciplines because you got to learn more things and you got to learn to tie them. But I always say that the rewards are much bigger after because then you can chew things in different disciplines, which you will never be able to do if you stay in one dimension, right? But there's a risk. I always tell them there's a risk because people are going to say, Pierre, you're doing many things. You're not an expert. But I teach a case from Otis Elevator. I don't know Otis Elevator, like from Busbib, which was the president. And I have this in a video. He said, specialists have to become generalists. Because today everything is embedded. Everything is embedded. It's not business and IT. It's IT and manufacturing. If it's not, it's manufacturing and social psychology. It's always a mix. So if you really want to go far, you got to do the leap to be multidimensional. But that's hard.
It is hard.
That's why if you go in companies, they're not structured that way today. And that's why if you and I go in a company and we tell them, okay, guys, we love what you're doing, but let us help you and I, tie the dots together and say, what does that mean? We always function in silos. Why? Why would Pierre help the strategist talk to the portfolio manager? Because you need somebody to have the whole vision, but they're not there yet. They're not there yet.
No. They definitely, I think there's so much space and things have just grown. And I like the idea of a generalist. I've often said, and as a business owner myself and an entrepreneur, um, the worst that can happen to you if you own a business is for someone to fool you. And the thing is, so whether that's your marketing team or and I imagine for executives that run huge organizations, that must be a huge thing where they're getting sold concepts because people are throwing words at them that don't necessarily mean anything. And so as both an architect, but also someone who is an entrepreneur and runs an organization, I call myself a jack of trades. And it's not because I don't have the capacity to go into the depth of certain things, but I don't really want to spend my energy wanting to know the details of everything. However, I can tell if someone's fooling me. And for me, that's really important. And I say that to architects too. You need to know enough to know if you're being fooled. Because if you do not know that, someone says, oh no, it's going to take so long because it's la. You need to know if that's just made up or if it's a real thing. And obviously, there's simple things like you can say, show me, measure it. How did you get to that point? So these are all pieces that we can put together. But yes, and it's not a jack where you're trying to fix all the things yourself, but it's being able to make decisions, understanding what people are asking for, understanding the potential. Can you do it? Or is it not possible, is not feasible to do? Those kind of things we really do need to understand as architects. Anyway, let's go on to the next thing and let's talk about the future a little bit. There's lots happening. It's a very exciting environment. So you don't have to limit it to business architecture, but what does the future look like for you in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, okay. For me, or do you want to talk about me or about what companies you think, or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both. I think it's quite
Oh,
interesting, actually. I'm quite
okay.
excited about
So I'll start with companies. I
it. Yeah.
think, and like I have this sentence that I wrote, I just gotta read it to you, and I'm sure you know it, you've heard it. Einstein always says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Okay.
Yeah.
And Buffett always says that, right? So why am I saying that? Because the way organizations are structured, which was
Mm-hmm.
understandable in years where technology was not so prominent, where things were slower, it doesn't work anymore. Okay, you cannot
Yeah.
work in silo. It doesn't work. Having everybody has his budget, everybody has his own benefits or targets, right? Your target is separate
Mm-hmm.
than mine. I don't think you can do real transformation in such an environment. I think you have to change that. And some companies have started to do that, right? And the other thing, the agility, right? Everybody talks about agility. I hear about the agility day in, day out. And my answer to agility is very simple. I love agility if it's based on architecture. Okay, if it's not
Yeah.
based on architecture,
We definitely agree on that.
because so I always say, prior to giving agility to your project, give agility to your strategy management system. I
Mm-hmm.
always say that, right? It's always a question of being efficient. And I always say, between effectiveness, efficiency, and agility, the first for me is always and will always be effectiveness. You got
Mm-hmm.
to do the right thing, have long term objectives, know what you want.
Mm-hmm.
Then you want to minimize the energy when you're doing right, and that's efficiency, right? And of course, things are not going to go as you want, and then you
Yeah.
adjust and you bring agility. But I
Yeah.
have some feeling that people twist everything around, right? So they start with agility, and then we'll see about the rest. But if your agility, if you want to be agile, but you don't know where you're going, you're just gonna end up. We're gonna take a vacation probably in November, and it's as if like we decide to go because we love
We just
snorkeling. We
wing
decide
it.
to go to
Yeah.
Saint Martin, And the next day I tell you, hey, no, we're going to Rome to visit the museum and the Vatican. It's not going to work.
The example I like to give is when you are renovating a house, the only time when you really have to be agile is not in the design and the planning of what it is you want, but when you dig in and then you see, oh, this pipe is faulty, and then you have to adjust and you have to change what you're doing, and you have to, let's say that suddenly all the water is leaking, you're going to have to be very agile, and you're going to have to stop doing what you were doing and focus on this. So agility is a mindset, and a lot of people don't realize that a philosophy like agility, and the way that you think, doesn't mean that you don't have to plan or architect anything.
Exactly.
Nobody would just go, hey, get the builder up and maybe he'll put a few bricks up today and quickly do that. You want to actually have a plan when someone's building your house, and you want to, when you go on a holiday, to know where you're going to be staying and what the price is going to be, and that are there any events on. Those are things you want to know. And so, yes, I agree with you. A lot of it has been messed up by saying just do stuff without an understanding. Now, obviously, with waterfall approaches, there was this over engineering that occurred because everything had to be written down in terms of requirements. But again, architecture would have solved some of those problems
So
by having the overarching picture of what it is that we're focusing on.
I'll give you an example,
Yeah.
which I really like. Okay, a lot of people talk about agility. Say, Pierre, like we did agility, and it cost us 20% less. And so they always tell me that story. I say, okay. I say, now tell me, in 5 years, start now and tell me whatever you did today, if it's going to work in 5 years, and how much you will have put in it in the next 5 years for it to still be working in the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I've never ever had an answer to that. And
Mm-hmm.
this goes to the famous rework, right? Because
Yep.
the way the budgets are done today, they disappear in a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's when you do finance, you do a write-off. And ask what my prof always says, right? It's fine. You can look at a company. It may look good, but if they did 10 write-off the last 10 years, do you really want to invest in them? So it's the same thing. So
Yeah.
you can do projects, they're fine, but are you going to do rework? And this, if you go to the lean literature, they call this a monument.
Mm.
And what I can tell you from what I heard, I don't have any proof on that, but from what I've heard, all the monuments, a monument is something that you create that you can't take out. I give you an
Yeah.
example in the banks, the big mainframes, it's very
Mm.
tough to take out because they're core, they're expensive, and all the business, all the banking goes through there.
Yes.
So from what I've heard, I haven't seen studies, and I don't think we'll ever see studies because I think that would be too much of a secret. I've heard that with all the agility that they're doing, not all is bad, but they've created so many monuments. But
Oh,
instead of creating monuments in 30 years, they create monuments now in 10 years. So you understand? So now
yeah.
not only are there monuments, but there are many more. And now you have to take two out instead of one. You had the mainframe before, right? Now you have two, three monuments because they keep doing it. And don't get me wrong, I love agility. I think agility is
Yeah.
great, but it's got to be based on architecture.
Yeah.
So you see, you and I, we have the way I'm understanding, I may be mistaken, but we know that organizations need to change, right? We know
Mm-hmm.
that. So now what do I do as an architect? So that goes to the second part of your question. So I'm doing two things. The first, because I love the lattice work, I'm extending my model. Okay. So if you saw my book, we tie many things. I'm going to tie many more things in the future. So in part of my intellectual work and understanding things and phenomena, that's one thing. In regards to work, I'm doing the opposite. So in regards to work, I'm trying to do architecture-based strategy. So
Mm.
instead of the whole three plans, remember the transformation
Yeah.
plan, and then I'm
Yeah.
trying to say, okay, so how can I make it more agile so that we could teach the concepts of architecture to a
Yeah.
broader audience because everybody knows what strategy is, so that we can be more flexible in implementing it. So you see,
Yeah.
I'm cheating because in one way I want to satisfy my curiosity and my brain, and I want to make things lattice work and work better. But on the other hand, I know that in companies, by the time they change, you and I may be retired, right? So how can
Mm-hmm.
I still contribute? So I'm trying to do both. And I hope to do a lot of teaching on that because I love teaching. Teaching is my favorite part. But, and I think the teaching is unidimensional again, as I
Mm-hmm.
think you and I agree. So I would say these would be my top objectives to be aligned with my aims and the aims of companies.
Mm.
So that would be those would be my answers.
What do you think about AI and all the kind of new things that are coming up? Do you think that'll impact the role? Is it something you'd be interested in, considering your background and your interest in reading and research and those
Uh,
type of things?
that's why I love architect, because architecture applies to everything.
Yeah.
Everybody talks to me about AI, right? And they have step one, they devise what they want. Step two, the algorithm. Step three, the implement. I say, okay, but how are you going to architect all this now?
Yeah.
And that's what I always tell to my students. They say, Pierre, what discipline? Because we have profiles at our university. Which one? I said, choose the one you love. And let's say you, it's ERP, because I teach ERP also, or you love BI, or whatever. I said, choose the one you love and add architecture to it.
Yeah.
Because if whatever you want to do, you want it to be done well for the long haul and to evolve
Yeah.
in an efficient way, you need architecture under it. So I love AI. And remember when we mentioned before, I told you, remember I did a lot of hard and I went a lot to
Yes.
the soft. And that's what I
Yeah.
realized today. My hard, I have to get up to it. I have to refresh because I did a lot of stuff related to that when I was in university. But if you asked me today, I would have a gap to fill, right?
Mm,
But
mm.
oh, I think it's great. I think there's a lot of potential. But I think if they don't architecture it, we're gonna have the same problems as we had with the
Yeah.
ERP, the same as we had with the CRM, the same as we had with the website, the same as we had with the e-com. It's gonna be the same thing going over and over
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
So we got to architect it. So I think it's good for us.
Mm. I do think it's really good for architects because it is something that we should know well. We should. Um, okay, so final question. Let me have a quick look here. So we always end off with the same question, which is if you could go back in time and give yourself a piece of advice, what would it be?
Okay.
I know we've covered some
No, no,
of
it's fine. And as I mentioned before, you really made me think this last week, and I think it was very good. It wasn't
oh,
easy.
good.
A lot of people think, and I remember when I started to listen to podcasts, and they always end up with such questions. I always said, these are the easy ones, but actually they're the tough ones.
Mm,
So to make it easier for me, I'm going to combine your answer with what are the things we should do because some I did. There's some of them that I did not do, but some of them I did. Okay, because I think they're worth mentioning. The first, we mentioned the hard and soft science.
yeah.
And I was fortunate enough by the influence of my parents. I will not take the credit for that. This is it's part of my culture, right? Like my sister's a lawyer, the other one's an occupational therapist. That's what we had to do. The second one would be work for the best.
Mm,
Because like we mentioned that a little bit, remember when we started, I love my life. I really love my life because I can do a lot of stuff. But the little mini regret I have is I started at Microsoft. I started with a bang, right? I had a full
mm,
budget. I could do, and I was offered to go to Toronto, but I wanted to go to Redmond. And then
mm,
I said no. And remember, I could have went to the US. Then I did not.
mm,
Putting aside the family a little, because anyways,
mm,
I did a PhD and I ended up not having kids before, or meeting my wife before I was 35. But
mm,
considering that time span, I would work for the best, whether it's
mm,
Apple, McKinsey, Deloitte, the big companies, breakthrough companies, Facebook. when I have one of my students say, Pierre, I'm going there. There's always a little thing. Because sometimes you say I could have done it, but you could not
Yeah.
have. But
Yeah.
I know I could have.
Yeah.
I'm sure I could have. So I have a little pinch. So I would tell that to students. If you have big dreams, try them, especially
Mhm.
early on before you have the responsibilities with the kid and so forth. So that would be my second advice. The third, which is very important, don't compare your journey to anybody else's journey. Because I remember when I was doing my PhD, my friends had BMs, my friends were manager, and I was saying, what is happening, man? Like I'm eating sandwich, I'm studying 13 hours a day, and I have no job. I had a job, but if I look at today, what I do and with who I work, I wouldn't change it for the world. But it's very easy to compare yourself. Very easy. And I always say, if you want to compare in a positive way to improve yourself in one facet, that's fine. But if you compare the whole picture, not only one thing. So don't compare your journey and don't let anybody decide your journey but you.
Mhm.
Because I've seen too many people, no, stay that in 2 years, I promise you will get this. Oh, I promise that if you don't do this now in 2 years, don't do that. Don't procrastinate, especially when you're young.
Yeah.
Because like now I have kids, my kids go to school, my wife has a job, you have responsibilities. If I tell you, okay, come and leave everything, leave your business to come to Montreal for a year, it's tough for you
Mhm.
to do that. So especially when you're young, consider that. The third, read everything you can.
Mhm.
But there's a little, I would say, hook to that. Apply what you read.
Mhm.
Okay? Because I read a lot. I read a lot. But very often I take a book, I love the book, and I put it aside and I pass to the next book. That's not the way it should be done. You should take a book and then find a problem, whatever it is, and say, oh, how would I apply the book by doing that?
Yeah.
But by doing that, you would read much less, but you would be thinking much more.
Mhm.
And again, we always go to the what's easier. So if I had to do that, because everybody says, Pierre, how come you read that way? And I always tell them, even doing my PhD, I didn't read. Doing my PhD was hell for me to read an article because it was scientific or I didn't understand. I wasn't ready. I was sleepy. Today, it's a different story. Whenever I can take out a meeting and have an hour of reading, I love it. And the
Mhm.
finance course I'm taking today, I'm full of exercises. And when I had my first quiz, I wanted to kill the prof because he gave us 10, no, he gave us 20 minutes of videos, 10 hours of exercise.
Oh, wow.
And think, think about it. I said, it makes no sense. When you do it, he's actually right. Because now you don't have to tell me anything about it. I'll be able to do it intuitively. So that would be my fourth advice. The last one is don't be in a rush.
Mhm.
Because like I'm 50 now, like I'm 53, and I did uh, quite some stuff, right? I wrote a book, I did different stuff, and I still have 15 years. So go to a good pace, but it's not a sprint. It's more of a marathon.
Mhm.
And be careful with that because you don't want to get burned. I certainly did not want to tarnish my personal life. There was no way I was going to do that. No way. And because of that, it took a little more time. Because of my schooling, I went to school like 5, 10 years more.
Mhm.
But if I had to do it again, demain matin, I would do it again. So these would be my philosophical suggestions or insights if I had to go back again.
I think that's really good advice for anybody. I think we've had a great discussion. It's been really good meeting you personally
Same here.
and at least having a one-on-one. I'm so glad to hear from an architect who understands that all parts need to come together, that lacing that I think you mentioned, you talk about the lacing of it together. I think it's very impressive that you've written a book. I know you say take it easy, but that's a lot of stuff you've done. Getting a PhD, working, writing books, training, all of that. So, very impressive background. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and your personal experience and with the broader group. I really appreciate that. Any final words you want to leave for anybody? And
No, I'm very happy. And again, you made me think. And every couple of, I wouldn't say years, but stopping and thinking is the tough part.
mm,
Because the first time I saw the questions, I said, easy breezy. Then I sat down again. I go, oh, it's not that easy breezy. And then I followed the way I work. You know what I did? I read them. Then I put some bullets and that I didn't
mm,
touch it for 3, 4 days. Let me use my intuition, my subconscious to see. And then I came back again and I improved it. And
mm,
it cleared the way I think about things and the way I teach things today. So you see, a lot of the metaphors I've used with you, I realized that I should actually use in my courses, which I've never did
yeah,
before. So thank
that's
you
good.
because it was fun
That's
doing it.
good.
It was great meeting you. It was fun doing this.
And for those who are watching, please contact us via LinkedIn, contact Pierre, contact myself if you have any additional questions or you want to add it to just the chat on LinkedIn. Please feel free to do so. But we're here. I hope you found it beneficial. And thanks again, Pierre, and look forward to seeing you. If I ever am in Montreal again, I will make sure. And if anyone ever comes to New Zealand, let me know because it's not highly likely. But yeah, you never know. Somebody might want to escape the Canadian winter at the end
Oh,
of the
I told you I would love to.
day.
That's it. That would be great.
All right. Thanks so much.